The first speaker will be Professor Geraldine Thomas. She is a professor of the molecular pathology at the Imperial College London and among many other things. Director of the Chernobyl Tissue Bank. Her research involved the molecular mechanism involved in the development of thyroid cancer. I invite Professor Geraldine Thomas. Floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. My goal here is to try and dispel some of the myths around the public health risks from radiation from nuclear accidents. We have a real problem with radiation. There's a long history that we have of being made to fear radiation, primarily from atomic weapons, but there is a general acceptance of medical radiation exposure and exposure to natural radiation, for example, in spas, which is believed to be beneficial. There's quite simply a relationship between dose and response to all toxins, and we tend to think of radiation as something special, but it's not. It's just another toxin to which your body is exposed. And the dose response, as you'll see, is fairly simple. We have a problem in that the individual dose from radiation in the environment depends on many factors, so communicating why the dose is what it is actually quite challenging. It's not as simple as taking a tablet in the morning, you know what dose you're taking. There are many things that can affect your dose to radiation. And I think perhaps the biggest problem we have is that the perception that the individual dose, so the dose to which an individual is exposed from a nuclear accident, is way higher than it actually really is in real life. We also use far too much jargon. And scientists are guilty of this. We can't help it. We have to use jargon in our everyday lives. But we need to find a way of better communicating that jargon. Nuclear power is a political football. When politics comes into the room, you know you're going to have problems in communication because immediately you get bifurcations in society because they take one political viewpoint or the other. There are loads of misinformation out there on the internet and very little understandable science. So we need to make sure that people have access to that. And it isn't helped by the fact that the industry constantly tells us it's safe, which to most public, as soon as you say it's safe and I can make it safer, means it wasn't safe in the first place. So we've got ourselves into a real mess over this and we need to communicate much better. The public perception is that there is a heightened awareness of a hazard of man-made radiation relative to radiation from natural sources. You're all exposed to radiation. Anybody who flew here on a transatlantic flight has been exposed to more radiation than the rest of us. So we have to adjust this unconscious bias around man-made and natural. It's not just the nuclear industry that suffers from this. If you look at the pharmaceutical industry, that also has similar problems between the fact that anything from a plant is nice, anything that we make as humans is bad. The association of hazard with risk is actually down to belief rather than the scientific evidence. So how do we dispel some of these myths? Well, first of all, when does a hazard become a risk? This is the LNT, which is a great way of illustrating do not have a hypothesis that you cannot test. And we can't test this. There's a basic lack of understanding in the general public between dose and effect. And I think part of that is actually caused by the LNT because the message that comes from that the public get is radiation is dangerous at every level. But actually, when you unpack the evidence for this, here we have some data that was taken from a figure in the radiation restatement by the Oxford Martin School, which pulls together all the really big studies that we have done on humans, and it's important that we look at human studies, not animal studies, because we are trying to protect humans after all. And they simply pulled all the results together and put it on one graph. So this is the graph here. Now, you will see that there are the lifespan study from Japan, which is the study of atomic bomb survivors, from which we get actually a huge amount of data. Most people think that that is a high-dose study only, but actually, if you look at where the data points come from, those few blue points there that actually drive the steepness of the LNT curve actually come from a very small population in that study. And in fact, 45% of that study had doses less than 5 millisieverts. And they're the individuals donated by the pink dots around that circle. But what we're really interested in terms of nuclear energy, is actually the very low dose end of that. And I've magnified that low dose end at about 500 millisieverts and below. Now, immediately you see that, you can see that many of the points are above and below the x-axis, and many of them have 95% confidence intervals that go above and below the axis. That immediately should tell you that we really can't tell what's going on at those low dose points. It may be that it's beneficial, it may be that it's not beneficial, but actually we really don't have a clue. So why we've decided to put a straight line through it, I'm not quite sure. So, what really we're interested in terms of exposure to the population is actually below 100 millisieverts, which is where that arrow is. So if you can focus on that area, you can see just how unreliable we are in it being able to draw anything through that particular area. So what does that actually mean? Because I can show graphs, but most of the general public will go glaze straight over, and I can't understand that. So here's a good infographic that explains that. So here we have 100 Americans. I'm really sorry to the Americans in the audience. We don't dislike you. It's just the fact that you have really good health data. So you're a good place to model this on. So we have 100 Americans, and by the way, the ladies are wearing trousers in this, so they're both sexes represented. I've given 100 Americans 100 millisieverts. How many of them do you think actually get cancer from that dose of radiation? Well, the answer is 1. How many of them get cancer from other factors that give you cancer? The answer is 42. So as somebody who deals with cancer all the time, am I bothered about the one that gets it from radiation? No, I'm actually much more bothered about the causes for the other 42. And obviously, as we're talking of a straight line on that curve, if you give 10 millisieverts to 1,000 Americans, one of them will get cancer, 420 of them will get cancer from other causes. So the lower the dose goes down, the more insignificant the risk actually becomes. So we have 2 radionucleotides which are of concern for the population in the event of a nuclear accident, iodine-131 and cesium-137. The likely health effects are determined by the dose of radiation delivered by these isotopes to the body, and those two are very different. If it's a low dose, obviously going to have a small health effect. A large dose will give you a larger health effect. And as I said before, the dose is varied depending on what the individual is doing, were they sheltering, were they outside, were they eating contaminated food, or were they not, were they young and drinking lots of milk. Lots of things can affect actually the dose to the individual. So we know an awful lot from Chernobyl. We have a large number of direct thyroid measurements, and we know the individual dose range was actually huge. The range of doses was below 1 gray to 60 gray, directly to the thyroid itself, not to the whole body, but to the thyroid, because the thyroid concentrates radioiodine. If you look at cesium, it's a very different thing. So the average dose to residents in contaminated areas of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia over nearly a 20-year period from exposure to cesium was only 10 millisieverts, because cesium has a long physical half-life and a short biological half-life, so actually most of it passes through your body without releasing the radiation. Now, to put that in some form of context, that's the same as a whole-body CT scan. So are we surprised we don't see any effects from cesium? Well, I'm personally not. So these are the health effects from Chernobyl. 28 people died from acute radiation syndrome. There have been 15 deaths from thyroid cancer over 25 years. The prediction is that we will have 16,000 excess thyroid cancers. We know we have a 1% mortality rate. That's around about 160 deaths, because we can actually treat thyroid cancer very easily using high doses of radioiodine, ironically. There is no scientific evidence of increased thyroid cancer outside Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, but you can read everything on the internet. That doesn't make it scientific. And we know there is no other effects that we can see. Now, we would predict that we might see an increase of cancer in the liquidator cohorts. These are the people who cleaned up the mess. However, so far, we have not been able to attribute a single death in those cohorts that are being followed up to radiation. There was one report of an increase in a type of leukemia that we don't normally associate with radiation, but actually that was only found in one of the 4 groups. So the jury is still out whether there's actually any increase in death in those cohorts at all. So the only public health consequence from physical exposure to radiation from Chernobyl was thyroid cancer in children, and that was due to high doses of iodine-131 in fallout. But the most damaging health effect has been a psychological consequence, leaving people to fear what the radiation might eventually do to them. If you look at Fukushima, we know the doses of thyroid were an awful lot less than in Chernobyl. Most of the residents had estimated doses of less than 2 millisieverts in the first 4 months post-accident. And we know that the whole body counts show that the Japanese were very efficient at cutting the food chain, and very little cesium actually got into the food chain. So that conclusion was that there were no discernible health effects that were expected from the radiation at these doses. But because people felt the need to move quickly because they were scared of the radiation, 2,000 deaths resulted from a very hurried evacuation. And we mustn't forget that 20,000 people died in the tsunami. So let's try and put some of that radiation risk in context. If you look at a megacity living in London compared with Inverness, Inverness is lovely, but there aren't many jobs out there, you have a 2.8% increase in mortality. If you live with somebody who smokes, not even smoke yourself, a 1.7%. And if you were a Chernobyl liquidator at varying doses, your risk is 1% or 0.4%. And that is only if, actually, we do see any deaths in those cohorts, which we have not yet seen. So what are the consequences of public myth versus scientific evidence? Well, yeah, I'm sure you've all seen or heard of the HBO series on Chernobyl, which dramatically was brilliant. Scientific fact-wise, a few problems with it. And Kate Brown's book on a manual for survival, which caused all sorts of issues when it was presented this year. But unfortunately, all of that leads to these type of headlines. Those type of headlines are exactly what causes the psychological damage. So what have we got to change? We need to provide information to communities via stakeholder groups on what to do in the event of the accident, and it should be given before the accident occurs. The Japanese had simply said there will not be an accident. That's probably not a sensible approach to take. And this is very simple: shelter inside buildings, orderly evacuation for the short term, although I question actually whether evacuation is really required. Minimise consumption of local food rich in iodine, milk or leafy vegetables. And don't panic. That's the most important thing we need to say, because that panic will result in far more casualties than the radiation exposure. And if you think about it, that's exactly what we do in response to a chemical exposure. So why are we treating radiation differently? We have to build effective communication on trust, those who are running the plants. But there is a general problem with big industry and the public believing people are safe. But if you put a personal face on that, you might get somewhere. Trust that those regulating the industry, regulators must have teeth. If they don't have teeth, nobody is ever going to trust them. Trust of the workers within the plant. I think if you encourage the workforce to interact with local and more distant communities, so that people actually see, well, I know him, he goes down the pub, he drinks with me, they feel that they can trust them much better. And trusted communicators. And these are often people who are not associated with the industry or government. And I think the key thing is to find a public figure who understands the energy debate and can communicate on risks and benefits, usually with the help of a scientist in the background, but it doesn't need to be the scientist doing the communication. And here's just a few people who you probably recognise who have joined in the energy debate, having been taken on board what the scientific community has actually said about the real risks of health effects from radiation. So effective communication. I think all methods of energy generation have risks and benefits. That's not something that all the public actually generally understand. We've got to balance the effects on our ecosystem with the risk of lack of energy and recognise that everything pollutes to a degree. And we know that the effects of CO2 and particulate pollution are likely to be catastrophic for life on Earth, and not just for humans. So for those people who don't particularly like humans, who like dogs, there's your in there to talk to them. tailor the message to suit the audience. You'll have a wide variety of people there. You should be providing the same facts, but you may have to use slightly different language in order to get your message across. So my take-home messages are, don't wait for the next accident. Start a dialogue now and do it with all levels of society about why nuclear matters. I'm hoping that some of the conversations that we've seen this morning and yesterday will actually get out of this room. I think we need to almost evangelise why nuclear is necessary. I think that message is starting to get out, but it needs to get out more. The internet means everybody has a voice and expects their voice to be heard. So we have to make sure that the scientific facts are also available there in a digestible form. We've got to put real evidence-based risks into a context that humans can relate to. We are useless at risk assessment and understanding the difference between risks. So we need to find a way to help communicate that. And hearts and minds only change by dialogue. But there's one important thing. As my friend Andrew Shelley says, you have two of these and one of these for a reason. You should listen before you speak, because actually you might find you're not addressing the correct problem unless you're listening too. And finally, I think we're now in this situation. We've considered every potential risk around nuclear, except the risks of avoiding all risks. And we've got to balance the risks to environment and individuals. We need to change our way in which we deal with risk perception and the general public. Thank you very much.